Welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, and thank you for joining this session today. We're going to be exploring key developments in the blockchain space throughout the African continent. Focus is going to be placed on regulation made from government, on pilots and trials, and education. My name is Laura Franco Henao, and I'm delighted to welcome Pascal Sama from Coincentrix Capital. Welcome, Pascal.
Thank you, Laura.
We'll be taking questions throughout the session, so please put your comments and questions for Pascal in the comment space on our session page next to the stream. You can also ask questions using the hashtag ThinkDiff on Twitter. Now, Pascal, could you tell us a little bit more about your story and why Concentrix Capital was created?
Okay, I'll start off by telling a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Cameroon. It's located in the west central part of Africa. I spent the first 14 years of my life in Cameroon, and the remaining 15 till date in the US. So I guess you can guess my age then. And basically, I did my high school education in the US. I moved on to my bachelor's degree at Georgia Tech, where I received a bachelor's in electrical engineering. And while in school, I was really involved in undergraduate research. There happened to be a program that pairs you up with a PhD student, and you can basically assist them in different aspects of their research, which is what I did. And it kind of exposed me to the whole concept of being inquisitive and learning about new technology and trying to put the pieces together to figure out how to use those technologies to solve very complex problems in the transportation business and communication business and so. And that basically led to me getting my first job in the telecom industry, working for AT&T as a network engineer. And through that experience, I met some really interesting people, and thankfully I met my current partner at Coincentrix, which at the time was starting his career, and he was from Nigeria and I'm from Cameroon, and we're both having discussions of different interesting technologies that can create impact in the continent as a whole. And we experimented with a lot of different technologies, from IoT to big data. And at the time, he was finishing his master's, doing his thesis in the network analysis of Bitcoin. And we decided to consolidate around blockchain and build Coincentrix, which is a 2-year-old startup as of now. It functions a lot like a research firm, but then we are involved in other technologies apart from blockchain. We're doing a project for the world's busiest airport, Atlanta, where we'll be using geofencing technology for traffic control. So that's a little bit about myself and Coincentrix.
Thank you, Pascal, for this introduction. And I forgot to mention that you have also been part of the DIF last year, in which you did a great job. For the audience that didn't watch this session, could you give us the main highlight?
Oh, yes, I can. So the purpose or the focus of last year's presentation was to make a comparison between the different major activities going on in the blockchain space in the world. And by the world, it's mostly in the developed nations. There's so much activity going on and very few presence in the African continent as a result of a lot of factors, like maybe lack of knowledge or limited infrastructure. But at the same time, we kind of shared some trends that were very interesting, like the Google searches. I think Nigeria, Ghana, and one other African country shows up pretty high in the amount of searches for the word Bitcoin or blockchain or so. So basically, it indicates there's a very high interest in certain areas of the continent. And then if you also look at the demographics of the African continent as of today, the average age is 20 and getting younger. And Africa has the second largest number of unbanked population. It almost accounts for 17% of the world's unbanked population. So there are all these interesting trends that we're trying to highlight to show to our audience the reason why blockchain technology would have a solid foundation in the African continent, and different parties that are interested should strive to make sure that that happens. And then we ended up the presentation by showing some examples, some concepts on how blockchain technology can be implemented. And previously, before that, we highlighted the whole blockchain technology. We gave a high-level explanation of what it means and how it works, and also its history. And yes, we concluded by examples and existing projects going on in the continent.
Okay, thank you for that. I think that if you are part of the audience and you want to see the presentation from last year, we just left in the comment space on our session page the presentation, so you can watch it there. Now, so for this DIF session, Pascal, what is it that you want to focus on, and in which countries are we gonna be giving examples?
Yeah, so this session, it's more of it's a good follow, a good piggyback to the previous one, because it's almost like within a year worth of time frame now, we observe where the industry was and where the industry is going. And so I would focus on just the main concepts of drivers for where the industry is going, like regulations, educations, and pilots, and finish off by being more specific in different projects that are really in very good positions of creating a lot of impact in Africa. And the examples I'll be giving are from a project in Ghana, which I've been following very closely, and actually met one of their developers, Bitland, that basically creates hashes for digital. It creates a digital hash for land titles, which is a really very important service to have in the in most African countries, because land titles are all done in paperwork, and it's very easy for someone to fortify that. And another example I'll be giving are in Kenya, where they have the BitPesa. It's a remittance system over blockchain. And I'll also give some examples from Nigeria, where there are also a lot of similar remittance applications that have been developed of recent.
And for the audience that is maybe not used to talk a lot about cryptocurrencies or blockchain, could you give us a brief refresher of how these technologies interconnect and work?
Yes, I can. So I guess a blockchain network functions a lot like an existing global network, which we're all accustomed to, which is the internet. The major difference between the two is you have these protocols that basically ensure that data is distributed between all nodes and all participants of the network. And instead of internet traffic or data traffic as we're used to with the internet, on a blockchain network, the data that is being transferred holds some types of value, right? And the value is basically determined by the common interest of everyone. That value could be in the form of monetary. It could have a monetary value, or it could have just a value of records, right? So you can think of it as a network that can represent any type of value and which is shareable globally. And another cool or big differentiator of the blockchain networks over other types of networks is the fact that it has a consensus protocol that allows for every node to be updated within seconds or within minutes. And essentially, every node would be aware of all transactions that occurred over the network. And it's a really good feature because it keeps the security and the health of the network and provides a good foundation for many services that involve um, third-party participations. It basically makes those obsolete because the network now can audit itself, is self-auditable, and it's also very interesting because there isn't any. I guess the limitation to a blockchain technology is access to the internet. It's kind of interesting. I'm using the internet as as an example to explain what blockchain technology is, and actually blockchain technology runs over the internet. So that's basically what it is. It's a decentralized network, and most blockchains are open networks where anybody can participate, anybody can be a node. And some blockchains are private. There are very few private blockchains, and most of them would be institutional. For the most part, they are decentralized systems, and they are self-auditable, and they transfer value, and they are very secure networks.
And what is the current state of these technologies across Africa?
Across Africa, there's a very interesting pattern. First, given what happened last year with the sudden surge in the price of Bitcoin, that led to the creation of a lot of other cryptocurrencies known as altcoins. There was a huge concern from an investment standpoint for the protection of investments for the country's people. And a lot of African governments put out the communication basically telling their people to be cautious on how they invest in cryptocurrency, given the sudden inflation and now sudden deflation of the price of Bitcoin and a lot of other cryptocurrencies. And they did that, it totally made sense for them to do that because it was a global activity going on in other countries, protecting people's investments. And out of the 41 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, about 21 of them put out a formal communication advising people to be very cautious while dealing in cryptocurrency. And the remaining 20 did not put out a formal communication and have not made any stance on cryptocurrency, which is very interesting because it could be either a big advantage or it could be a big risk, right? And the risk there is it opens the room for bad actors to be involved in maybe money laundering or some form of activity that is not to the benefit of the general public. So in terms of regulations, there's been a lot of communications from at least 50% of the sub-Saharan African governments on caution while investing in cryptocurrency. and the same 50% of countries that put those communications out there also made some statements relating to the value that they see in blockchain systems. And out of the 20, five of the countries, specifically Cameroon, Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana, and Kenya, have been actively involved in tests or trials to understand the technology more and basically give them a solid stance or just education on how they can regulate the technology. So those are the three activities that are going on now in Africa: regulations, educations, and trials. And I think it's a good blend because they are all necessary for the technology to have a sustainable growth in Africa.
And what are the problems that this technology could potentially address for people in these countries in Africa?
Yeah, so the first big benefits of blockchain technology to the African continent would be financial. As I mentioned, Africa has the second largest number of unbanked population, and there's a lot of reasons to that because having a bank account in the developing world, it's not as easy as the developing world. There are so many requirements. For example, for security purposes, they might want to have some form of land title associated to your account so that in case you were given credit and you could not afford to pay the credit, they can hold the land title as a security. And then not everyone has a land title or land, and that creates some type of limitation. And there's also a lot of demographics selection and a lot of systems that do not benefit the average person to have an account. And so with blockchain technology, everything functions over the internet. It's easier for people to have access to the global economy because it's a technology that runs over the internet. Everyone has access to the internet. And then it's also a technology that is able to transfer value and also store value, which are two big features of any type of monetary value or currency. So it creates a big opportunity for the unbanked population to still receive financial services and have access to the global financial or global financial networks. I think that's the biggest impact they can have in the continent, and which is really interesting because when people think of Africa, I guess there's the aid piece of it. There's a lot of aid associated with Africa, and I believe in 2000 and I believe 14 or 2008, one of the two. I'm getting my years wrong. There was an interesting trend where 4 years previously, the amount of total aid Africa received or sub-Saharan African received compared to the amount of investments were almost the same. It was about 20 billion each. And then fast forward that to 10 years later, 2014, there was a huge gap between the two. The amount of aid received was somewhere around 30 billion, and investments were about 70 billion. So there's kind of a switch in perception of the continent, and there's a lot more investment being poured into the country. And blockchain technology now puts itself in a position to secure both aid and those investments by providing access to the average citizen. and also the whole security aspects of the blockchain, and accountability, right, which can really benefit the aid section of the help to Africa, or the aid section of Africa, and at the same time secure the investment piece of this whole trend or transition that is going on in the African continent.
Okay. We actually have a question from Twitter from
Okay.
Leo that is asking if internet access is still a barrier, in your opinion.
Yes, so internet access is a barrier, but then when you look at the trends that were released by the International Telecommunication Union, that is a very big union that oversees a lot of progress in internet access and regulation globally. It actually shows Africa is one of the regions that is growing exponentially when it comes to internet penetration, which means in the next maybe 3 to 5 years, there'll be a lot more people connected to the internet. And then there will be a transition of focus from connectivity to quality. So I choose not to look at that as a limiting factor, because from my experience when I was in Cameroon, I saw a lot more people that had access to the internet, especially of my generation or younger. They were accustomed to the internet, and they were limited to specific types of application, especially mobilely. They were limited to Facebook and WhatsApp. But there is some form of activity in the continent that that is sufficient to develop technologies on the infrastructures that they have. And I kind of look at it like it's better to be early in the game than later in the game. If there was a striving network with good quality and enough capacity to support everyone and a really good infrastructure, then solutions like this would have already been in place then. But I think it's important to build solutions now and understand how the network infrastructure is going to transition and grow your solution around that transition.
Thank you. And we actually have another question from Marta that is asking if you could tell us about some of the success stories or some examples of these technologies in Africa.
Yes. So I would start with Bitland because it's a really interesting project which I've been following for a while. Basically, I'll start off by saying what the issue is. And this is a project based off Ghana. I think most of the developers and team members for these projects are in Ghana. And they're solving the issue of land titles verifications. And this issue in a lot of sub-Saharan African countries where there's a lot of resale of property. One person can resell their property several times, or someone that do not own a property can sell that property, and it creates a lot of conflicts where you can have multiple people that have a land title to a specific property. And part of that is because of the paper system that is still going on. It's easy for someone to create a false documentation and use that to close a deal on land sales. So it creates a lot of issues, both for the owners of the land, the people involved in paying for these lands, and as well as the government, because now the government has issues to deal with. It has settlements and all of that. And what Bitland is working on is having a digital hash or a digital, I'll call it a digital record that is stored on the blockchain and associated with a specific account, and it cannot be reproduced. So if anyone was trying to purchase a piece of land, they would basically refer to their platform that would specifically have information about who is the owner of the land, and all of the details of the land, including the prices. And I believe they can also do transactions. If you are willing to purchase the land through your platform, you can do it so, and you can always refer to that record. It's never destroyed. It's always going to be stored in the public ledger. And that is a good example of a blockchain solution that it's creating some impact in the continent. Apart from that, another cool project I got to also meet one of the founders is Bitmari. It's based off Zimbabwe. And I think the team of developers and participants in the project are distributed. Some are in the US and some are in Zimbabwe. And they basically provide financial solutions for farmers, for a group of farmers. And the issue there is sometimes performing trades can be very difficult, especially if they're happening in let's say urban areas, and farmers have to move their goods and have to find clients, and it's not as easy. It's not a very easy scenario in the third world country, given that a lot of the population is unbanked, and there are some scenarios where moving around with a ton of cash is not safe. And basically this platform, Bitmari, provides farmers with some type of financial banking service where they can close deals with different clients. And I believe now they're based solely in Zimbabwe, but they might be expanding to other African countries. So it's another cool project that is making an impact in the continent.
And what have been the determinant factors for the success of these projects? Was it, because you've talked about three of them, so was it regulation, education, or a pilot and trials?
I think for these two projects, it's a combination of education and pilots and trials, because they are actually, I believe, still in a pilot phase and trials. And they also had to do a tremendous amount of education to the general public. For example, Bitland had to have a lot of education with different homeowners to explain to them, hey, you can store your you can create a digital asset that has a record of your land title, and if you were to ever have an issue, you can reference this platform that would provide your credentials. If someone was checking who owns the land where your house is built, and it can keep you from having to go to court to solve issues of people reselling your land or somebody trying to take advantage of your land. So so there was a lot of education done. Same for Bitmari. Obviously, the farmers are not accustomed to blockchain technology, and actually they do not need to. They just need the service, right? They need some type of financial service where they can trade. So Bitmari most likely had an educational session with the farmers and also with the authorities. So it kind of involves everything, education, pilots, and regulations, because the regulators need to understand what they are regulating, which if they do not have the initial knowledge, you as the service provider or the application owner needs to educate them on what are the different risks and advantages, and what value does your application bring to the general public. So but the main focus is for these projects that I mentioned is pilot and education.
Okay, thank you. And we have one question from our website, and this person is asking, how much of a role does China play in the African blockchain ecosystem and development of the underlying fundamental infrastructure?
So, as far as China, I think the biggest activity I've seen so far in the exchange space. Exchanges are basically where people can buy and sell cryptocurrencies. And China's biggest exchange, biggest exchange, Binance. I see them making a move in the African continent, trying to partner with different local exchanges so that they can create cryptocurrency pairs for those specific African continents. I believe this is probably the biggest project, which also has a big impact on the continent, because exchanges are required for people to have access to cryptocurrencies, since they're one of the main sources where people buy and trade cryptocurrencies. So I think that's the space they're involved in, which is more on, the investment piece of the whole industry. And it could really go a long way, because a lot of solutions are starting to build on exchanges, because that is where the trades are going on, and that is where the liquidity is, and that is where potentially local banks might be able to build remittance solutions and be able to still have the liquidity behind them. So I think China is playing a role more on potentially building the financial infrastructure that would be needed for different blockchain projects to take advantage of.
And I have one final question for you. That is, what is the role of Coincentrix Capital in ensuring that these technologies strive in Africa?
Okay, so our role is heavily on the research side. Out of the three factors which I mentioned, regulation, education, and pilots, we're more focused on education and pilots. At the moment, we are working with a university in Nigeria, in Osun State, in Nigeria. Basically, we are introducing them to the technology. And then along with that, we're starting to set up specific types of research that would create knowledge for the university to build on and come up with even bigger research projects to how blockchain can be adopted. An example of a project which we are involved in is the speed test analysis, which I guess one participant earlier on Twitter had a question about if the internet is a big limitation to access to blockchain technology. That's actually a research that we'll be doing with the university, where we would try to understand during the peak hours how many transactions can be executed, and we would do those test runs from different locations. So really, it's not so much testing the blockchain itself, but testing the infrastructure and understanding, okay, if a bank or some type of remittance system or money transfer service was to decide to use a blockchain solution in Africa, what is it going to look like from an implementation standpoint? So the speed test would give us some insights about that. And apart from working with universities, we're also working with different businesses. Of recent, we're working with a bank in Cameroon in introducing them to the technology as well, and highlighting what difference it can make to financial inclusion. And also, introducing them to different grants opportunities out there and projects that they can be involved in, to start, getting accustomed to the technology and seeing how it can be implemented in their catalogs of services.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, Pascal, this session has to come to an end, and I don't know if you wanted to add something to that last point.
Yeah, and then so basically, we're very open to new ideas and new concepts. So if you have any questions, you can definitely reach out to me. I'll share my information on the profile for this session on the website. And thank you to the DIF platform again once for having us do a session. And I look forward to having other sessions in the future where we could really broadcast or showcase what we're working on, especially since we're now getting into the research pieces in Africa and involvement with different businesses. And it will be interesting to show some data on what is actually going on in the ground from our end.
Thank you, Pascal. And I hope the viewers online have enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. I particularly have enjoyed hearing about how important it is for blockchain technologies to strive and success in Africa and the problems that they can address, and also to hear about some of the examples of success stories that are taking place already in the African continent. Thank you again, Pascal, and to the audience that has attended this session. And as Pascal said, you can learn more about all the things that we've talked about in this session by getting in touch with him. He will leave his contact details in the comment space on our session page. And if you still have questions or feedback that you want to give us or Pascal, please use the comment space. And of course, there are lots of events coming up at the Disruptive Innovation Festival next week. If you want to continue the conversation on blockchain, we have 2 sessions for you on Monday. At 10 o'clock, we have the session called Blockchain Business Design for Impact, in which we will explore how emerging technologies are changing the fields of design culture and what it means to start a business in today's hyper-connected world. At 4 o'clock, the session Using Blockchain to Save Fashion's Dead Stock, in which we will discover how a blockchain-enabled marketplace and supply chain tool can help factories to sell excess fabric and brands and creators to brands and creators. And also, don't forget that we are releasing films and podcasts, and that we have released many of them today. Thanks again to Pascal, and remember to catch up on everything that we have happening at thinkdiff.co.